I have difficulty saying that I supported the war because I don't support any war. But I think that the government of Israel was left with little choice than to respond militarily because Hamas, in ignoring the possibility of entering into a ceasefire 3 weeks ago, basically said to Israel, bring it on, we want you to come. And they provoked Israel both by the massive amount of rockets that were shot into Israel, and of course, it was discovered later the main threat, these tunnels that are leading into Israeli kibbutzim and shavim, right up to the doorsteps of people in civilian communities who would have been massacred if they could have carried out their plans to invade Israel through the tunnels. So I think that Israel had to respond militarily, but this is a very much of a chicken and an egg kind of discussion because the problem is really that life in Gaza is intolerable. And Hamas, a movement like Hamas, was born and came to power in a reality that none of us would ever agree to live in. The majority of Gaza's 1.8 million people are young people under the age of 25 who have no future, who have no hopes for a future, who are living in a reality in which for them death is a better option than life. And when that's the reality you live in, you end up a movement like Hamas. Okay, so what I'm saying is that there is no military solution to this conflict. There can never be a military solution to this conflict. It has to be a political solution and an economic solution. And it has to answer the basic problem that people living in a situation where life is not possible, it creates a situation where people are willing to die. And that's what gives birth to a movement like Hamas and gives support to Hamas. So that's what we really need to address. We have a really interesting geopolitical reality in the Middle East today that's unlike anything that we've ever had before. The Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic, political Islamic extremism of movements like Hamas are the enemy of the states that surround Israel, including Egypt, which took action against the Muslim Brotherhood, and
Okay, no problem. All right. So what I was saying is that we really need to address the core problems of the horrible situation of Gaza and the continuation of the occupation if you don't want to end up being in the same place a year from now, 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, but only much worse. Well, I think that right now we have a very difficult situation because there is no effective Hamas leadership. The leadership is detached from the reality. The leadership in Gaza, Hamas, is underground, in bunkers. Their communication is disconnected. They can't communicate with each other. There's no communication between the local leadership and the leadership outside. It's a really drastic situation. And Hamas already had a very complex decision-making process. It's a decision-making process of consensus. Ever since Israel assassinated Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, and then assassinated in 2012 Ahmed Jabri, the commander of the Hamas fighting forces, there is no real leader of Hamas. Khalid Mashal is not a president or a commander-in-chief or someone who can make a decision. They have this very complex decision-making process, and that's why it's very, very difficult to get them to agree to a ceasefire. I think the conflict can only really come to an end if we address the root causes of the conflict and then create a situation where the people in Gaza and the international community, led by the Arab moderate states, impose a solution on Israel and on Hamas. That's the only way we're really going to be able to put it in, because we can create some kind of humanitarian ceasefire. People will get tired of it. The Israelis will end because they run out of targets. That's what happened in 2012. So Israel can run out of military targets. That's what happened in 2012. And Israel doesn't want to completely occupy Gaza. Certainly the army doesn't. And my sense is that Netanyahu doesn't want either, because there's no way of knowing how we'll get out of Gaza once we
I really think that the only real sensible ending is for Israel to capitalize on the common interests that exist today between the state of Israel and the other moderate and the Palestinian Authority leadership that Hamas is not the answer. We really need a political solution that will build around the Arab Peace Initiative and enable Israel to use the support of the other Arab states in the region to deal with Hamas. This is not just an Israeli problem. This is a problem for Egypt, it's a problem for Palestine, it's a problem for Jordan, it's a problem for the other states in the region that all fear political Islam, radical political Islam like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. So we actually have allies in the region for dealing with this problem, and we need to use that in order to confront Hamas. If Israel confronts Hamas alone, Hamas wins. Hamas will be supported by the Palestinians and supported by the Arab world against Israel. But if it's the entire Sunni moderate Arab world that's taking out Hamas, Israel can actually stand on the side and allow them to deal with Hamas. Sure, we could take the classic case of the Gaza disengagement. When Ariel Sharon decided that Israel was going to leave Gaza, he refused to negotiate with Abbas or even coordinate with Mahmoud Abbas, with Abu Mazen, the transference of Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, which would have given a victory to moderation and diplomacy. Abu Mazen had been elected in 2005 on a ticket of opposition to violence, to the armed struggle, to the militarization of the Intifada, and he asked Sharon to coordinate with him and to allow Gaza to become part of the beginning of the Palestinian state. Instead, Sharon said to Abu Mazen, "You are not a partner. We have no Palestinian partner. We are leaving Gaza. We're not going to give it over to anyone." And we destroyed all the assets that were left there, the 21 settlements we demolished and left rubble for the Palestinians to take over rather than leaving them something they could have used, for instance, to provide housing for refugees. Sharon called Abu Mazen a chick without feathers, and those who won the narrative of the Israeli disengagement from Gaza were Hamas, who said that we hit Israel, we used the armed struggle, we used our resistance, is what they call it, against Israel, and they said something which many Israelis find almost humorous, that what Hamas said is that Israel only understands the language of violence, of force. And they took over Gaza, and they won the elections as a result of that as well. And this was a classic case of rewarding the extremists rather than the moderates. Well, that's what needs to happen, but will probably not happen, unfortunately. Probably what will happen is that there'll be a ceasefire deal, and the Americans and the Qataris and the Turks and the others will negotiate some kind of opening up of the closure of Gaza, of the siege, the economic blockade of Gaza, and Hamas will declare victory and will get credit for providing relief to the people of Gaza, which really needs to happen, but it shouldn't be that Hamas should get the credit for it. It will be, Hamas will declare victory regardless of what happens, because Hamas will never surrender. And they will declare victory saying that we stood up to the Israelis, we shot the Israelis as far as Haifa, Zichron Yaakov, Tel Aviv. We shut down civil aviation to Israel. Our leadership has emerged at the end of the war intact. Our military commanders have emerged intact. We lost a lot of rockets. We lost a lot of property. We showed the real face of Israel to the international community. This is what they'll say, and they'll claim victory. Israel will also claim victory, and Israel will say we damaged Hamas, we limited their ability to attack Israel, we cut their rocket supply, we demolished the tunnels, and Israel will be very happy that with the massive use of force, they created deterrence. In other words, Hamas will be scared to attack us. This is what they said in 2012 as well. I never believed in deterrence in 2012, and I don't believe that it's being created today. You can't create deterrence against people who are not afraid to die. Now, I'm not talking about the Palestinian people in Gaza. I'm talking about the Hamas leaders, the Hamas commanders. These people are not afraid to die, and you can't have deterrence against people who are not afraid to die. Israel will declare victory, but the victory in my mind will be very much like the victory of George W. Bush over Saddam Hussein and look at Iraq today. If we manage to demolish Hamas, reduce them, kill their leaders, we will get tomorrow Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Gaza. That's the alternative that we're facing. And they won't have rockets. They won't have tunnels. But they will have other ways of hurting Israel. Cyber terrorism. They'll shut down Israel's banking operations. They'll attack the Ministry of Defense operations. They are creative. They are dedicated. They are motivated. They want their freedom, and they are fighting for it. And they continue to surprise Israel with their motivation and their ability to fight back. And they'll come up with new ways of fighting back. I have no doubt about it. What we need to do is defeat Hamas, but we can't defeat Hamas militarily. We can only defeat Hamas when the Palestinian people understand that they have a better option. And the better option is when Israel is really willing to end the occupation and to make peace with them. That's when we'll defeat Hamas. When the alternative of moderation and negotiation is not a ploy for continuing to tell the world that Israel wants peace when it makes no decisions for making peace, and really sits down at the table to negotiate a deal that will allow Palestinians to have the freedom that they deserve and to the end of the occupation, which no longer can be justified. Right, I think it's important to, for anyone who has doubts about this, to listen to Khalid Mashal's speech in 2012 when he was in Gaza, because there he was asked to explain why he accepted the 67 borders, and that he reiterated what he's always said, is that Hamas will never accept Israel, will never recognize Israel, will never make peace with Israel. We're willing to take the 67 borders now because that's what we can get, but we're not talking about peace with Israel. We're not talking about a two-state solution. And in addition to that, Hamas has never given up the idea of the full right of return of the millions of Palestinian refugees to Israel proper. So this is really a tactical ploy by Khalid Mashal, who's learned to speak to the Western media. Hamas is a very extreme organization that is dedicated to its non-recognition of Israel and not making peace with Israel. And the acceptance of the 67 borders is just the very first stage of what they believe. The thing is that I have tried for 8 years to convince Hamas people to enter into some kind of dialogue with Israelis, with academics. I've tried to do it as an international meeting. I found more than four countries willing to host it. I've talked to people who are often told, who are often internationals tell me, international diplomats and others tell me, these are the moderate people in Hamas, and I've talked to them about dialoguing with Israel. It's secret dialogue, secret meetings that would take place with Israelis, not officials, not government people. And they have all refused. They've all refused either because they're afraid to participate, or because the leadership has vetoed it, or because they themselves say, we have nothing to talk to Israel about. Look at Fatah, they say to me all the time. Fatah has negotiated with Israel for 20 years and got nothing. The only way we're going to get something is when we hit Israel until they are no longer here. This is what they really believe, that Israel is a passing episode of history, that Israel has no real place in the Middle East, and that eventually Israel will disappear. And they believe that time is on their side. I'm not even sure that they're talking about that. They believe that Israel is a colonialist empire transplanted into the Middle East, that Israelis are not natives of the Middle East, that they will never integrate into the Middle East, and eventually Israel will simply disappear. This is their kind of mystic, messianic version of political Islam. There are some people who in Hamas who I would call pragmatic. I would not call them moderate, but I would call them pragmatic and understand that Israel is here for a while. Israel is here for the next decades. And in terms of that, it's better to find a modus vivendi with Israel than to constantly be at war with Israel. And those people talk about we're willing to deal with Israel for commerce, for electricity, for water, for our own needs so that we can survive, but we still won't recognize Israel. One of these moderates is very well known, Dr. Ahmed Youssef, who's a political advisor to Ismail Haniyeh. Dr. Youssef often pens op-eds in papers like The Guardian and The Independent, New York Times, Washington Post. And I had a long conversation with him several years ago for a few hours in his office in Gaza, in which at the end of the conversation he said to me, look, Gershon, I will never recognize Israel. I can tell you that my son will never recognize Israel. What my grandson does, I don't know. So that was the most that he could give. Initially, what I wrote was what I called an Israeli initiative for stability and security in the region. After understanding that no one in the Israeli government was really willing to take it seriously, I redrafted it as a US initiative, and I sent it out to the US ambassador and the US consul general in Jerusalem and other people on John Kerry's team and some people in the White House, and I haven't gotten any responses. I today sent it off to the Egyptians through their intelligence officer in the Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv, and I asked him to transfer it to Cairo as perhaps an initiative. The basic idea is that in exchange for Israel accepting the Arab Peace Initiative of March of 2002, which would be a basis for negotiations between Israel and Mahmoud Abbas, the representative of the Palestinian people as the head of the PLO, Israel then could also ask the Arab League to send a multi-nation Arab-led force to Gaza to stabilize Gaza, peacekeeping force to stabilize Gaza, to disarm Hamas, to create the ability for Israel to end the economic siege on Gaza, and to bring about the creation of a non-militarized Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza next to Israel on the basis of the Arab League Peace Initiative. Obviously, this is a long and complex process, but the idea was that if Israel were to accept the Arab Peace Initiative issued by the Arab League, then the Arab League might be willing to take responsibility for, in the immediate period, for the stabilization of Gaza. It would be led by a force of the Palestinian Authority and Egypt and Jordan and perhaps others from the region. Hamas would object to it, but the objection of Hamas to a multi-nation Arab force would be substantively different than its opposition to Israel. And because we would be talking about ending the occupation and creating an independent Palestinian state, we would win the hearts and the minds of most of the people of Gaza and the West Bank and the Arab world in that direction if Israel were only serious about doing it. As I said, I didn't think that anyone in Israel was willing to talk about this. And what I will say is that it amazes me, it really amazes me, that Israel is sitting and waiting for others to give it some kind of political solution. Israel is the startup nation that creates new inventions every single morning, and we have the initiative on the military field, but we're waiting for the Egyptians, the Americans, the Turks, the Saudis, I don't know who we're waiting for to give us a political initiative and not doing anything on its own. And I said, here, this is an initiative that Israel could take. It has so many benefits for Israel, but what we're lacking is a political leader, a prime minister, who actually thinks that Israel needs to take a political initiative, and that's our biggest problem. The Israelis are not seeing the pictures that the rest of the world are seeing. They're not seeing the television stations of the Arab world. They're not seeing the BBC and the CNN and other stations. What we're seeing on the Israeli television are talking heads of retired generals and security officials 24/7 who are telling us how wonderful Israel is doing this battle and how much we need to fight Hamas and how bad they are and how good we are, the most moral army in the world, etc., etc. That's what we hear. We don't see those pictures. Anyone who doesn't flip the channels and go to Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya or Egyptian television or Palestinian, they don't see it. So the Israelis are getting a very one-sided picture of this. They're not seeing the protest around the world, and the few glimpses of the protest around the world that they're seeing are being explained to them as anti-Semitism. It has nothing to do with it. Israel does is that the whole world hates us anyway, and this is just part of it because Europe has been taken over by Muslims. This is what Israelis are being told. So there's no real attempt to confront these realities that the rest of the world are seeing. In addition to this, 95+% of Israelis justify the war and are calling on Israel not to accept a ceasefire. The threat of the tunnels is a real threat. The communities around Gaza have been vacated. 1 million Israelis in the south are under constant rocket fire. 3 million Israelis are being attacked by rockets, and they can't see how the Israeli government can stop this war without dealing with it. I wrote on my Facebook page the other day that the Egyptians shut down more than 1,000 smuggling tunnels along the Egyptian Gaza border without killing one Palestinian. Just something to think about. Now, I'm not sure that the tunnels between Gaza and Israel are the same, but nonetheless, there are other ways of dealing with the tunnels than killing a lot of civilians. And I think that no one is asking these questions and no one is challenging Israel to say that there has to be a better way. We bombed Israel's only electricity plant today. Gazans are without electricity. They're receiving 5 or 10 megawatts of electricity from Israel, but that's it. 1.8 million people. No electricity means no water, means no hospitals, means no ability to use their phones, their internet. Think of what it means to live with no electricity. Even before the war, Gazans had electricity for 5 or 6 hours a day. Imagine what that's like. There is no way that Israel can justify the killing of all the innocent people who have been killed. We're saying that Hamas uses human shields, that Hamas puts its rockets in the middle of the civilian population. That's maybe all true. But when a majority of the casualties are civilians, and the majority of the casualties are civilians, non-combatants, we will have difficulty justifying this in front of the world. And it should be difficult for us to justify it to ourselves. The problem for Gaza has not been so much what's coming in, but what's going out. What's going out is nothing, which means that the Gaza economy is closed down. 90% of the factories in Gaza that used to work and used to sell goods to Israel or to the West Bank or to the Arab world or abroad are closed down, not only because Israel limited the raw materials in getting into the factories, but because they had nowhere to sell their goods that they were producing. That's the real problem. It's not only the building supplies. You can monitor building materials going in and make sure they're attached to real projects, and that's what Israel was doing over this past year. Most of the building materials that came into Gaza to build the tunnels didn't come through Israel. They came through the tunnels over Sinai. They came through the underground economy. They were building the tunnels with cement coming in from Egypt, with steel coming in from Egypt, through the Sinai smuggling tunnels, not through the registered licensed goods coming in from Israel. That's a monitored border. Israel can tell us on any given day how many trucks are going into Gaza, what goods are going into Gaza. This stuff is very carefully monitored. Plus the fact that there's a whole list of goods that Israel calls dual use. Dual use goods are goods that have a civilian function, but also could have a military function, and those goods are not allowed into Gaza. So we could have a military blockade, one that prevents the development of weapons in Gaza, one that limits the amount of and quantities of and types of materials that could be used for building bunkers, for building rockets, but still allow the civilian economy to exist. Why can't the Pepsi-Cola factory in Gaza, whose owner was the head of the American Palestinian Chamber of Commerce, have CO2 to make carbonated beverages? What is his CO2 going to be used for? But they wouldn't let him have it. Why can't he sell his drinks in the West Bank? Producing for the local market is not economically viable for him. So all these different issues need to be really regulated, and I think that at the end, Hamas is actually going to win this. The Gaza economy is going to be opened up more at the end of this war than it was prior to the war. Right, it's certainly the case. The people who have financial resources in Gaza have had generators in their homes, and those people could afford a generator and could afford to buy diesel fuel for those generators, have been able to survive. Now most of the electricity is cut out to most of the people in Gaza, and they won't be able to charge their phones, they won't be able to use their computers, they won't be able to use anything electrical. I imagine that Israel will increase the amount of power that it's putting into Gaza. There are 2 Israeli high voltage lines that go into Gaza, but Israel has sold Gaza very, very limited amounts of electricity until now. And they're going to have to increase that because it will take probably a year or more to rebuild the electrical plant in Gaza. And that's something which 1.8 million people can't live without electricity. I don't know how you do it. So this is a very big problem. I don't know that there's any immediate answer other than Israel increasing the power that it's applying to Gaza. And of course, you know, we have people in Israel who say, let's cut the power to them altogether. Let's send them back into the 18th century. Then they'll stop shooting rockets at us. And I don't know what people think, that they're going to embrace us with love after we turn them back into the 18th century. I think what we need to do, each one of us as an individual, is to reach out to people on the other side. We're going to have a lot of work to do to rebuild any kind of humanity and human relations between people after this war. I have hundreds of friends in Gaza, and I can't imagine the fear and the suffering that they're experiencing right now as we're talking, while they're being bombed by Israel all around Gaza. And what we have a responsibility to do as human beings is to reach out to them now, and particularly after this war is over, and make human contact again, and tell them that we care about them, and hopefully they will say that they care about us. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be the human relations between us as people, as individuals, as mensches, that will reach out and touch each other and say, we don't want to continue this. We need to build this grassroots support for humanity between Israelis and Palestinians that has all but disappeared as a result of this war. This is my biggest fear, is about how much damage this has done at the human level between people. I've been touched enormously by so many Israelis who have asked me to help organize now even activities to take Gaza children out of Gaza, to protect them. And I talked to people in Gaza, and of course no one was willing to send their kids. But I've suggested to people that immediately when this war is over, that we should find ways of making contact, of taking kids out, of taking mothers out, of bringing them into Israel, bringing them to the West Bank, bringing them to Israeli Arabs, showing a sign of caring, of humanity, of touching them, of saying we're sorry for their suffering. This is what we have to do, and this is the only real hope in the short term that we can provide for creating a new reality here. The big politics will find a way of playing themselves out. Israel cannot continue to live in this region if we don't end the occupation. And if Netanyahu doesn't know it, then we're going to have the help of the international world and the Jewish community around the world to let the people of Israel know that Netanyahu cannot continue as prime minister of Israel if he is not willing to negotiate a true peace with the Palestinians and end the occupation. This is over. This cannot continue. And the people of Israel need to know that it cannot continue. So we need your help, the Jewish community in the UK and in the United States and around the world and the rest of the Western world, to tell Israel this is over. No more occupation. There is a way out. There is a peace that is possible. There is the Palestinian leadership that is willing to make peace with Israel. We cannot continue to live in this way, because what's happening in Gaza now will only repeat itself if we don't end it, and we can end it. We know how to end it. We know what Israeli-Palestinian peace looks like. It's doable, it's feasible, and it's the only thing that's good for Israel.